Welcome to Season 7 of the Art of Teaching podcast. I'm Matthew Green and I'm so grateful that you've joined me today. It's wonderful to know that there are teachers across the globe that are finding our episodes useful, so please take the time to subscribe, share the episodes and leave some feedback. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the Dharawal speaking people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm recording. I pay respects to the elders past and present of the Dharawal Nation and extend that respect to other Aboriginal people that are listening to this. I hope that you get as much out of our discussion as I did. Please enjoy. Today I have the great pleasure of sharing a conversation that I had with Dr. Kathryn Garforth. Dr. Garforth has professional expertise in educational psychology and a personal understanding of the frustrations that children and adults with learning difficulties experience at home, school, and work. In this wide-ranging and incredibly honest conversation, we talked about her experiences at school and why she thinks the best revenge is success. I hope that you get as much out of our discussion as I did. Please enjoy. Dr. Kathryn Garforth, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time. Where are you phoning in from?
Vancouver, British Columbia.
I hear it's beautiful this time of year. Is it true?
It is. Summer has finally arrived. It was a little bit late this year, but it's finally here.
Yeah, fantastic. Quite possibly the most important question of the interview. What's your coffee order when I can finally get over there and buy a coffee?
Well, I don't drink coffee and I don't like hot drinks. So,
okay. What's your drink of choice?
I make homemade fruit syrups.
Okay.
We've got a fairly big garden, so I like doing a black currant drink syrup with a little soda water.
Okay, interesting. What is a book that you have read that has made you reconsider a few things in your life? It could be books. That's a difficult question, just to whittle it down to one.
I think the first one that really changed my life was If Horses Were Wishes.
Okay, I haven't heard that one. Why was that one so impacting to you?
Because I am severely dyslexic and I didn't read not even fluently at that point, but by myself for pleasure until maybe grade 6, and I would even call it pleasure. But that was the first book that I'm like, oh, there's maybe a reason to do this aside from everybody telling me to. And it's because I have a passion for horses and I was just taken in by this story. Yeah. And then, as I got older, it was the horse stories and novels that got me to read when I was such a reluctant reader.
Wow. That's really wonderful. Yeah. And we will talk so much about your work later on. I mean, it's just so fascinating about your amazing work with reading. And I love that you found something that just engaged you and something that you were interested in. And just a quick question. If you could have a dinner party with anybody, who would be there? Obviously your family isn't included in the head count, but who would you like to sit down and have a meal with?
Albert Einstein.
Okay, just Albert?
Isaac Newton would be nice. Some of the great scientists of past.
Yeah. And why is Albert Einstein such obviously he's a phenomenal mind, but why is he your choice to sit down and have a conversation with?
Well, just his profound quotes that really spoke out to me growing up, being being dyslexic, like I know he's often cast as a dyslexic when really that's not the case. But when I was younger, I remember there was a television station that had like a TV ad or a bus stop ad with Albert Einstein talking about how learning was difficult and whatever. Yeah. And that really spoke to me. And actually at the time, we were doing a bit of advocacy work because they were going to take the bus system away from the school that I went to. And there's a picture of me beside the ad. And then actually in high school,
that's awesome.
I had a line in one of the plays, and it was E = MC squared. And it was just like one of the last lines in the play. And I thought it was just so ironic.
Is that your only line in the play?
No. I had lots of other ones.
Yeah.
But like it was a play where we had a small school, so we played multiple roles.
Got it. Yeah.
And I had speeches and whatever, but that was, I don't know, just, speaking to the dyslexics of the past.
Yeah. Wow.
And the ones that have really made a difference.
Yeah. That's really beautiful. And I think we all need those role models, or those people that are like us, to be able to relate to. And I think it's so wonderful to see just how much hope someone like Albert Einstein gave to so many people, and really wonderful celebration of people's uniqueness. And so I agree, he would be a wonderful guest to sit down with. I played a seahorse once in a nativity play, which I'm not sure where the ocean was in Nazareth, but I think that was a case of me having a few too many students to fill the roles. And that wasn't a speaking role, so never mind. I'm scarred from that experience. Just wondering, Kathryn, what are you most grateful for from your parents?
Never giving up on me.
Okay. Wow. That's really amazing. Kathryn, would you mind maybe just spending a few moments talking about what your upbringing was like? I mean, you talked about obviously being dyslexic and not finding a passion for reading till later on, but what was that experience like? What was your upbringing like?
Well, upbringing versus schooling are very different, right? I have wonderful parents that did everything that they could with the knowledge that they had to do the best they could for me. I was very fortunate to be in a family that had the time and the resources to do what they could to help me. And my mom became an amazing advocate for myself. I have another sibling that has dyslexia, and the greater dyslexia community. She actually became a branch president of the International Dyslexia Association. Wow. She did huge fundraising work, and actually helped get together a documentary about dyslexia. And so I was very fortunate, and she would do anything to try and understand why her child was having such a hard time at school.
Wow.
And again, just believing in me because I wasn't learning to read.
Yeah.
And, at first they were told that I was a late baby because my birthday is in October. And in Canada, the academic year, the kids that turn, the age starts in January of the academic year. And then till December's are the young kids, but I was an October baby. So
that's the same over here.
Yeah. So I was, a late baby, and I'd catch up. And so they were just doing what they could with what they were told, trusting the professionals. But then it got to the point where the schools had given up on me.
Wow.
And said that I was a waste of their time, that I'd never make it to high school or graduate, and that they should just be okay with that.
Wow.
And they weren't. And
nor should they be, nor should any parent, anybody accept. And so were you Were you aware that you learned things differently at school, or did you like?
No, I was stupid, actually. That's what it was. At that point, I was just stupid and a waste of time.
Wow.
I was verbally and physically abused at school.
Gosh.
And it was not a pleasant experience for me.
Wow. Gosh, I'm so sorry that anybody has to go through that, or anybody has had to go through that, because schools are such, I think, sacred spaces. And I think I couldn't imagine the pain that that would have caused either yourself or obviously your parents. And you're such a shining example of what is possible when you don't listen to the opinions of people. And we'll definitely get into that more in a little while. But thank you so much for your vulnerability with that. I know that is part of your incredible story, and we will get into that in a moment. But was there a teacher that really made a difference in your life? Was there a teacher that decided not to listen to everybody else and really believed in you?
Well, in grade 3, there was a learning assistance teacher that first mentioned to my parents that she thought I might have a learning disability.
Yeah.
And I remember working one-on-one with that teacher. We had just moved houses into a new school. And, I liked working with her. But I mean, the teacher that really stands out to me is Ms. Marg Levine, and she was my teacher for grade 6 and grade 7 at a small independent school specializing in dyslexia. And there were 14 kids in the class, and she was amazing. Her passion for teaching and her love of her students. And the motto at that school was, if you can't learn the way we teach, we'll teach the way you learn. Wow. And she really went above and beyond. And the crushed child that I was when I went to that school, to within 2 or 3 days, I said to my Mom, I really hate to tell you this, but I think I'm going to like school.
Wow.
And, I went from failing math to skipping a grade in math in a matter of months at that school.
Wow.
And her taking the time to understand what I needed to succeed and showing me that I actually was intelligent. Wow. And worth listening to and worth spending the time with.
Gosh, I think everybody needs and deserves and is entitled to a teacher like that. I think that's so wonderful. Have you ever reached out and let her know that?
I have, actually. And we've had some good chats, and, she's definitely the one that made the difference. And, when you have big classes of, 20, 30 students, it's really hard to do that. But when you just have 14 students with you, and in most cases at that school, you would be with the same teacher for 2 years.
Wow.
And really establishing that rapport and relationship, really made the difference.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong with this, but was that your year 6 teacher in the private school? Because I believe that you moved in around grade 5 to grade 6, you changed schools, and was that a completely different experience? Going
100%.
Wow.
Going from a public school where I was bullied horribly, running home at lunch and after school crying.
Gosh.
To going to a school by bus with 54 students who are all dyslexic. I can't even explain the difference, and realizing that I wasn't stupid.
Wow.
I wasn't the only one that struggled with reading. And actually, if you took the time to teach me how to do something, I could do it really well.
Yeah. And what was that like when you found kind of your tribe and a group of students that approach reading or approach academics in the same way that you did? Was that a wonderful experience to know that you weren't alone and that there were other people that had similar challenges to you? What was that experience like?
It made things that much better. And, I made friends that had dyslexia and couldn't read and were learning to read the same way that I was. and, they had their strengths and weaknesses, and I had my strengths and weaknesses, and that was okay. We weren't judging each other for that. We were embracing it and realizing different people had these gifts. I remember one of the kids on my bus, he was the most amazing storyteller.
Wow.
And it was about a 45-minute bus ride to school there and back every day. And he would have a bus of 20 kids silent, hanging on to his every word, just because of his amazing storytelling abilities.
Wow.
And that's when you think of people like Hans Christian Andersen, who was dyslexic.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And these different gifts that they have. And it was a safe place, and it really felt like home.
Wow. That's really beautiful. And like, I think everybody deserves that, and I think reading your work and your sort of incredible story is so inspiring, because it just makes me wonder how many students are sitting in classrooms right now that don't feel like they belong, that they don't feel like they're understood, or their uniqueness is not celebrated. And I think the more people that share their stories as bravely as you're doing, the easier it gets for other students to say, hey, yeah, this is me, this is how I am. And so it's really, really, really wonderful. And Kathryn, what do you think that speaks to about sort of the importance of how we personalize education for our students? I mean, why is that so important? Because I know in Australia, we tend to, we have some very rigid structures, or schools that are quite regulated and so on and so forth. And I wonder what that says in terms of how we personalize education and why that's so important.
I think it's essential, and I think we need to do a better job. I mean, I would love to be out of work and never hear another story where a child isn't getting the support that they need. And as the parent of a dyslexic, I can tell you that things are better in some ways when we're not having the same level of bullying and ignorance. But there still is the struggle and the damage and the misunderstanding within schools. And the thought that technology is just going to solve the problem, like, oh, okay, well, they can have an iPad and an e-reader, and they can use voice to text, text to speak, or text to print, and that's just masking things. When I was a student, my mom got me this tile that said, "Success is the best revenge."
What's wrong?
And that's something that I have internalized. And that's my driving force, is trying to make sure that everything that I can possibly do, I try to do to make sure that no child ever has to go through what I went through as a student, because it was horrendous and left lifelong scars.
Wow.
And I know it's made me who I am today. But no child should have to go through that.
So what are some of the misconceptions about dyslexia? What are some of the things that you think people maybe get wrong or misunderstand?
Well, I think it goes back to, the very start, right? When you see a student who's struggling or doesn't seem to be getting things, they just need to try harder, right? And the guilt that parents get for, well, you didn't read enough to them. And as a parent, I can promise you, I have read a lot to all of my children. My children were unique in the fact that even as toddlers, they would sit and listen to me read to them for hours. They loved it. We were reading novels to them as bedtime stories from a young age. And, like we were reading James of the Giant Peach. And they just loved it and absorbed it. And I know that's unique. I know most kids at that age are not like that, but I can promise you I read to my children, and we've got thousands of books in our house. At all levels. So we need to get rid of that belief that it's just being read to more.
Or it's something that parents have done wrong, or they're not doing enough of.
and that the
Wow.
children are lazy or not trying hard enough. My supervisor wrote this book, Not Stupid, Not Lazy, Understanding Dyslexia and
Wow.
Other Learning Disabilities.
Yeah.
And it really highlights some of those key things that kids with dyslexia or other learning disabilities, hear all the time. You're not trying hard enough. If you just tried harder, when people don't realize that it can take 10 times the amount of work to get the same result as their peers.
Yeah.
Right. The other thing that I remember was really frustrating for me was having a teacher assume because they knew a dyslexic or they've had a dyslexic student before, that what worked for that dyslexic would work for them.
Yeah.
Or would work for me. And actually, I had a teacher in grade 10 that was dyslexic, and he decided that, the way that I needed to do things was this way because it was the thing that golden ticket for him. Perfect. Only it highlighted some of my areas of weakness. So it made things that much more difficult for me.
Right.
And it wasn't working. And one example that I always like to give is, so I have a sibling that has dyslexia, and as sibling, we're not identical twins, but we're siblings. So we have a fair bit of similar genetic makeup, and our dyslexia or our profile is different. Yes, there are some similarities, but only some of the things that worked for me work for them, and vice versa. So when you have two siblings that are dyslexic and not the same things work for them, then that's when you're like, okay, well,
Yeah.
when you're talking about people that have no relationship, and I've known twins that are dyslexic.
Yeah.
And again, some of the things work, some of the things don't.
Yeah. I think that's so important, not to generalize or to stereotype any children, and any sort of. I think it's really important to realize that there are ranges of additional needs that are required, and sort of what are your thoughts around the sort of the language of sort of how we describe dyslexia? Are you comfortable with people saying that it's a disability? Are you would you mind spending a few moments maybe unpacking that?
Sure. I am pro diagnosis when appropriate. I am fine calling myself a dyslexic. I have always been fine calling myself dyslexic.
Yeah.
And I don't think it is a negative thing. Getting that diagnosis changed my life because that's when I realized that I wasn't stupid.
Yeah.
Right. There was a reason, a valid reason for me to be struggling.
Yeah.
And I had these strengths in like spatial relationship when I was in the 94th percentile, and in math I was up in the 90th percentiles, even though at school I was failing it because I couldn't do the reading associated with it.
Yeah.
I didn't know what the question was asking me.
It's really important.
I couldn't follow the lines. I couldn't fill in the graph because that's not how I could do things. That was testing my disability, not testing my ability. So I found that to be very therapeutic. And I was very fortunate that I got to work with Dr. Linda Siegel, and I worked in her reading clinic. So I actually worked at assessing individuals and doing the testing. And I worked with people who were, 5 all the way up to, I think one man was in his 70s.
Wow.
And just getting, partway through the test, some of the adults would break down crying because they'd realize not sad tears, they're happy tears.
Yeah.
They realized that there was a reason.
Yeah.
There was a reason for this.
Wow.
And it's, if someone has diabetes, that's a valid diagnosis, right? There's a imbalance in their endocrine system. If someone has dyslexia and they have a phonological processing deficit, well, that's what we need to help support. And as someone with dyslexia who has had a lot of intervention, I still have a phonological processing deficit. And I still, the reason why I'm not in academia is because of my dyslexia. I cannot read material fast enough and comprehend it at a rate that you need to. As a professor, I cannot put out publications and journal articles at the speed that needs to be done because of my dyslexia. I am not a classroom teacher because of my dyslexia. I make spelling errors and I make grammatical errors. And I was told by the Faculty of Education that I would not be a suitable teacher because it wouldn't be the proper modeling for the students.
Tell me, like, there's so many questions I have. There's so many questions I have. So tell me about, like, you received your doctorate.
Yes.
You are a doctor, PhD to be specific. What was that process like for you? Because I mean, statistically, you probably shouldn't be doing what you're doing. Like, I think the whole notion of doing a PhD for me is absolutely terrifying, but yet you have shown that you are able to take something which some people perceive as a deficit and use it as a strength. So how on earth, tell me about that. How do you then begin that process of completing a doctorate, and what was that experience like for you, and what lessons do you think there are for other people that are in a similar situation to you that want to prove people wrong? Or does that come back to that tale that your mother gave you about overcoming? Sorry, that was a terribly worded question. I'm just in awe. So feel free to pick that apart and do whatever you would like.
Sure. I think I should maybe start at the beginning. So that school that I went to, Kenneth Gordon, at my graduation, because it was only a primary school, so it ended at grade 7. Their prediction for my future was that I was going to be helping dyslexics around the world everywhere.
They said this in primary school?
When I was in grade 7,
Yeah.
I just
wow.
finished grade 7.
Wow.
And I have that written somewhere. I should really dig it out. And
need to get that on a t-shirt or something, or a coffee mug, or bumper sticker. Yeah. Anyway, I digress. Sorry.
Okay. So my mom did a lot of advocacy work. She put on conferences. She talked with the big names, but at the end, she was always just a parent.
Yeah.
And well, you're just a parent advocate. And I saw her frustration, so I knew I wanted to do more. And actually, I started working with other dyslexics and their families when I was in high school, helping them understand their psychoeducational assessments, which is what we use to diagnose a specific learning disorder or dyslexia, and then understanding how to advocate for their needs and get the appropriate accommodations and supports. So I did that, and I really wanted that to be like my life job. And I was like, well, you can't do that. No one's going to pay you to do that. So I went away to university for a degree in computer science, because my mom's like, well, you should be a teacher. I'm like, well, I'm not going to be a teacher if I can't do what I want. So I did a degree of computer science, and at university, they recognized my advocacy abilities. And then in those days, it wasn't as big of a thing, right? You weren't learning how to advocate for yourself at school in those early years. And they asked me to join the President's Advisory Committee at the university to advocate, to help the university learn how to meet the needs of students with disabilities. So then I was on that while I did my undergraduate program, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, wow.
I was part of, a community making change. And then I was in a couple of research publications as a participant, right? They're asking me how they could make things better. And I really liked that. And then with one of the things, we actually created a package to help university professors and employers understand individuals with disabilities. My contribution was the learning disabilities, but they also did vision, hearing, mobility, and social emotional
So can I ask, were you the subject of those papers, or were you like,
I was one of the panelists. So I was one of the students that they were interviewing to get information about how professors should know or what they should know. So I actually ended up teaching this course to some university professors when I was like, I don't know, must have been maybe 20.
That's intimidating. Yeah.
Well, I've been doing advocacy for so long, and I've been in 2 documentaries about learning disabilities. To me, I'd rather do that than write a paper any day of the week.
Yeah.
Any day of the week. So that wasn't so bad. And then, I started doing tutoring on the side and really enjoying it. And one of the things as a student with dyslexia, was having these people that were trying to tutor me or help support me, like, oh, I know what it's like. I'm like, no, you don't.
Yeah. Sorry. So patronizing for someone to say, yeah, I know what you're going through. It's like, no, you don't. You have no idea.
Yeah. And then, so I found that, when working with other dyslexics, they're like, oh yeah, you get it.
Yeah.
And that was a great buy-in to a lot of students who had that learned helplessness.
Yeah.
And no one could work with because they were done. And they're like, you know what, you don't know what it's like. And I can say, well, actually I do. And you know what, here's a documentary that I was in that takes it from me at that age.
Yeah. Wow.
And you can see what I was going through.
Yeah.
So then I did my bachelor's of education, and I was hugely disappointed with the reading instruction and the language and literacy education program. And being someone that struggled to learn how to read, I was very upset that we weren't being taught how to teach children how to read. And when I brought up terms like phonological awareness and phonemic awareness, they're like, oh yeah, don't worry about that. I'm like, well, what about the kids that can't read? Oh, that's what the learning assistance teacher's for. They'll take care of that. I'm like, okay, well, you know what? Right now, all us new teachers are going to be the ones getting those jobs because no one wants them, and those are the only postings that are available.
Yeah.
And then even, the stuff on learning disabilities was very vague and not very useful, not really helping these teachers know how to make things better for their students or understand what was happening. So that got frustrating. And it was actually funny. I mean, I find it humorous. You have the dyslexia, like only dyslexics can read this. And a couple of my classmates were doing this example of what it was like to have dyslexia. And they're giving out these passages, and, someone was randomly going to be the dyslexic. I got the passage and I read it flawlessly, like when it was my turn. I was like, well, who has the one that, that's hard to read? And I'm like, well, you mean this one? And they're like, well, how can you do that? How is it so easy? I'm like, just is.
Wow.
So anyways,
we've all been in professional learning where those passages have been handed out, but I've never thought of it naively from actually a position of someone who actually has dyslexia. Like, we sort of assume we know what it's like, but that of course is ridiculous to assume that. So wow. And that must be there seems to sort of be a bit of a common thread there by people thinking they know what you're going through, and that thinking that they know what dyslexic students, what their experience is like. But I mean, they really don't, do they? So I think you bring such a unique perspective on that.
It's the same thing with ADHD, and it's the same thing with autism. You don't really understand those perspectives unless you've experienced them or been very, very close to someone who has.
Yeah. Wow.
So during my master's program, I was able to work with Dr. Linda Siegel, and that was an amazing experience. And I'm very thankful every day for that.
Yeah.
And I worked in her reading clinic. So I learned how to do some of the assessment pieces. And I found that fascinating, and it really helped me hone in on my skill for intervention.
Yeah. Wow.
Because not only could I understand what the student was going through, it helped me give me that deeper understanding of why.
Wow.
Right. And what we could do to support it.
Yeah.
And then I was done my master's. I'm like, well, what else do you do? You do PhD, right? So I did a PhD. Why not? it was a cool thing to do, I guess. And well, I guess that's not true. I wanted to have the letters behind my name saying that I knew what I was talking about and I wasn't just some dyslexic.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I am someone with severe dyslexia, but I also have a PhD in specific learning disabilities. So
do you and sorry, I want to be sensitive with how I ask this question. So if I say it wrong, please feel free not to answer.
Don't worry.
Are you proud of your dyslexia? Are you so maybe it's more appropriate for me to say, are you glad that it's a part of your life?
I wouldn't know who I am if I didn't have dyslexia.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
I
That
would
no
have
means
this-
meant to be disrespectful.
No.
Because
No, don't worry about it.
Such an integral.
It's
part of who you
I
are.
am.
Yeah.
And I actually remember, so I went to school in a rural area where there were a lot of missionaries coming around trying to convert you into this religion or that religion.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that I got them to leave me alone was I'd ask them, so when I die and go to heaven, will I have dyslexia? And then it was like, oh no, you're going to be in your purest form. You know, you're not going to have any problems. Well, then I don't want to go there.
Yeah.
I'm dyslexic. It's who I am. It's how I see the world. And it's how I'm making a difference.
Yeah.
I would never wish it on anyone else.
Yeah.
I wish that my child didn't have to go through the struggles that they're going through. And I remember I was talking to a class when I was pregnant with my eldest, and they said, would you ever wish that your child had dyslexia? And at the time I'm like, oh, I don't know. Like you learn things differently and you have the different talents, but I can tell you now, I wish they never had to suffer the way that they've had to.
Yeah.
And that's with a parent that knows what's happening.
Yeah. And I can't even begin to imagine, like I said, what that is like for yourself, but also as a parent of a wonderful child that is going through that as well, I think. But it does seem like for so much of history, we have tried to fix things, or we've perceived, I guess, learning difficulties in some ways as a deficit. But I think you're amazing. You're an amazing example of what's possible and how we can actually use our uniqueness to our ability. And I think of some of the most brilliant minds that have really changed the course of history have seen the world in a slightly different way than most people have. And I wonder how we go about, I guess, changing that discussion away from trying to fix something to actually being able to work with people's uniqueness. I mean, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that, about how we can actually celebrate difference a little bit more in education?
Well, I have lots of thoughts on that, but I think there's one element of my story that may speak loudly here. And that was, so after I finished my time at this school specializing in learning disabilities at grade 7, I needed to get another psychoeducational assessment to see where things were. And the psychologist said, great news, you're cured. And I'm like, excuse me? No, I'm not. I'm not cured. I still have a hard time. No, but you're cured. You don't need to worry about it. And that was probably one of the most, aside from everything that I dealt with beforehand, that was one of the most traumatic experiences of my life, because I was terrified I wouldn't get the support that I needed.
Wow. And
I was terrified that I would have to go back to public school.
Wow.
And that was a very, very difficult time for me. And it was so hard for me to hear those words because I knew I wasn't.
It's so tricky, because I don't think, like, and I could be wrong, but it doesn't seem like, it seems like that wasn't necessarily malice in this person's voice.
No. They were trying to say, look, you've worked so hard, you've come so far. And it's like, but that doesn't mean I'm not dyslexic.
Yeah. And can I just ask, I mean, I do want to, I'm getting so absorbed in this discussion, and there is so many questions I want to ask you, but I do want to be respectful of your time. But
we can go another hour. I'm fine.
Tell me a little bit about your work with language acquisition for non-English speaking students, and if there are any I guess, parallels between that and how we teach students how to read and how to engage in literature, because I just found that so interesting. My speciality is working with students from non-English speaking backgrounds. And so when I read that, I felt like a light bulb had gone off. So tell me a little bit about that.
Phonological awareness. End of
Okay.
story.
Love that. Okay. And are there just some good practices that help people regardless of ability, regardless of a language background, regardless of approaches, that really help students to engage in reading? Obviously, phonological awareness is one of them. But what are some of the parallels that you see between those things?
Okay, so in my PhD dissertation, I looked at English language learners who had a Chinese language as their first language and came to kindergarten with little or no exposure to English. And then I looked at their ability to read in the Chinese language, whether they could read simplified or traditional characters.
Yeah.
And their ability to speak in the
Right.
language at grades, I think it was 2, 3, and 4. And then, so I did a few measures in Cantonese and Mandarin based on what language they had as their first language.
Yeah.
And then looking at their abilities in English.
Right.
And they're the students that gained English very, very quickly, because all of these students were fluent English speakers by the time that I was working with them.
Yeah.
But there were the ones that really kept up on the Chinese school and were still fluent in Chinese. And they're the ones that lost it. The thing that really came about in the research that I was doing was looking at the errors these students were making in their reading and in their spelling, and looking at the phonological awareness and the phonemic awareness deficits that we were seeing.
Yeah. Wow.
In their formalized scoring, and then comparing it to their ability to, with spelling and reading. And the way that you read Chinese is different. You use the same areas of your brain. It's the same process, but you're looking at the word and the syllable level instead of the phoneme level.
Got it. Yeah.
Right. So they don't necessarily have the same attention to the phoneme. And you would see that. And then the other thing, when we're working with students that have English as an additional language, is understanding the phonemes in their first language or first languages and how they differ from English. Because there's something called allophones, and that's when a sound, it means the same thing. So you don't really notice the difference, right? So, and the sound that's made by the TH are allophones in English. In I think it's both Cantonese and Mandarin, the O and the are allophones. So they're the same. Yeah. And unless we train the individual's ear to hear the difference, they're going to struggle with that.
Wow.
So that's where that phonological awareness and the phonemic awareness training can really help support the students that have English as an additional language. And then we can see it in their spelling. And I know there's a lot of stuff about, phonological awareness and phonemic awareness and overdone or too much or this, that, and the other thing. But I think it's all about how you look at it. And what you're doing with information from it.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. And for those people that are not aware, what is the difference between phonemic awareness and phonological awareness, and why are these things so important when it comes to teaching students how to engage in reading?
Okay, well, phonology has to do with the sound system of a language, right? And there are different levels of phonological awareness. There is the word level of awareness, and that's hearing the difference, or like knowing how many words are being spoken. There is the syllable awareness, where you can count the syllables and you can hear the syllables. There is onset rhyme awareness, where you can split a syllable into its first consonant sound, if it exists, and then break that apart from the vowel and any final consonant sounds. Now that's different from linguistics, where we have the onset, rhyme, and coda, where the onset is the same.
Yeah.
The rhyme just deals with the vowel, and that's R-I-M-E, not R-H-Y-M. Is that right? No, whatever. You know what I mean.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Y-M-E. There we go.
Yeah, that's right. Hang on. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the coda is the final consonant sound.
Yeah.
Then there's rhyming words like fun and sun.
Mm-hmm.
And then the phoneme level is the individual speech sound within the language.
Yeah.
In the English language, depending on dialect, there are 44 phonemes. And the problem with that is there's only 26 alphabetic letters in our Latin or Roman alphabet that we use to represent our spoken sound.
Yeah.
So the other thing when it comes, so the phonological awareness has to do with awareness of all things. And if you can comprehend spoken language, you have an unconscious level of phonological awareness, right? You can listen to words, you can understand what they mean, you can speak into them. Toddlers are really good about elongating words with not even thinking about it, and breaking words into syllables without even thinking about it. But as soon as we start teaching literacy skills, we want to bring that unconscious awareness to conscious awareness, because they actually have to think about it, because we're trying to encode or assign letters to the words.
Yeah.
Another reason why phonological is so important, especially when we're working with students that have English as an additional language. English is a morphophonemic language, and I'll get into that in a minute. But that means that our words are written at the phoneme level, right? So our words are written based on individual speech sounds.
Yeah.
Now, other languages, their transcription for their language could be whole word or in syllables. And that's going to impact how the individual processes the spoken word when they're reading it and printing it. And for something like Hebrew, you can write it without vowels.
Yeah.
Right. But in English, vowels are extremely important and some of the most problematic areas.
Yeah.
Now, English is a morphophonemic language. That means that our words spelling comes from morphemes and phonemes. Morphemes are larger units of speech that carry meaning, and those are prefixes, suffixes, roots, bases, they're affixes. There are things like pre, meaning before. And our spelling system defaults to morphology before it does to the phonemic spelling of the word. So that's why we have all of these words that don't necessarily sound the way that they're spelt. There's also an additional factor that doesn't work with the morphophonemic. It's the etymological history of the word. So where that word comes from. Because English is taken from so many different languages, we use the spelling systems where those words historically come from to impact our spelling.
Yeah.
And when we understand that, it makes things make so much more sense. And honestly, like right now in front of me, I've got a book called The ABCs and All Their Tricks.
Yeah.
I've got SL is for sleaze, but SN is for sneeze, understanding consonant clusters. And I've got Unlocking Literacy, Effective Decoding and Spelling Instruction. So these are all books that focus on that morphophonemic relationship of the English language.
And that's some serious, for those people that obviously we're recording audio here, but that you got some serious tabs sticking out of that book. So I can tell it's been very well researched.
Yes.
So is it true, Kathryn, that is English a particularly difficult language? I mean, you talked a little bit about etymology there and also the different phonemes and so on and so forth. Is it difficult, or is it the way, do we need to change the way that we are teaching students to engage in English, or a little bit of both?
It is a difficult language. I'm not going to say it's an easy language. There are much more transparent languages.
Yeah.
English has a deep orthography. Because not only are there are those 44 phonemes, but there are over 200 ways to represent those phonemes. So just learning phonics isn't enough for us to sound out, okay, that's a K. We also need to learn the rules around the orthography or the spelling patterns of the language.
Yeah.
And once we learn those, it's a lot easier. And there's another book called Uncovering the Logic of English. It's like a 4.5 hour read according to Audible, or what's that?
Yeah.
Kindle or something. Yeah. And honestly, I think every teacher should read that book, because the way that the vast majority of us have been taught that are currently teachers in the education system is based on a balanced literacy or whole language approach to reading. So we don't know those rules and patterns. And that's really doing a disservice. So it's requiring that teachers go on that steep learning curve to understand it. So they can use it in their classroom. And honestly, like, so this is what I needed to learn how to read. So this is what I got at those schools that specialized in learning disabilities. My husband is not dyslexic. And I know I've been working with our kids talking about spelling, and he's like, oh, I didn't realize that. Like, why didn't they tell me that? That
seems
would have
like
made
it's just
it a lot easier.
practice. Yeah.
Exactly. So the good news is we do know a lot about best practices for teaching reading. It's just kind of stuck in the pipe, getting from understanding how to do it conceptually and theoretically to getting it into the classroom. And that's where my passion is really strong at the moment. And I'm doing everything I can to get that information out there to teachers so that they can make that difference. And, I've been speaking with teachers a long time now. And even, just that first dabble into this stuff can make a huge change in your classroom, and it's worth the effort.
And I'll make sure, if you don't mind, that I grab your reading list to put in the show notes so that teachers can have access to these resources, or any books that you think are must reads for educators, because there's so many that you're holding up there and showing, and I'm going to write them down. And so if that's okay, I might grab from you at some point.
Of course.
A bit of a reading list.
Well, and the thing is, so, I have a company called Garforth Education. And in that, I'm trying to help educators understand best practices. And there are so many amazing books out there that are great reads, but they're not ones that I'd recommend to be that first book into learning that stuff, because the terminology and everything that it's talking about is just like, whoa, that's an overload, right? I'm not there yet. So it's all about finding that basic entry into understanding what this is all about, so that you can decide where to take your next steps to go further.
I think that's so important. And I think I missed, or that part of the schooling was omitted from my education, where they actually talked about the mechanics of the English language and spelling and how to grammar and all of that stuff. And so I think for anybody, it's a really good, sometimes it's a first read, sometimes it's a refresher, but I think understanding the reason why we do the things we do in the English language is super important. Because I know when I first started teaching in kindergarten, it was terrifying, because I didn't know how to explain some of these rules to 5-year-olds. I didn't know what I was doing. And so to get some of those, like I said, some of that reading list from you would be wonderful. And Kathryn, I did just want to ask you about your amazing organization, Right to Read. I know we've kind of talked a little bit about
the Right to Read initiative.
Yeah, sorry, the Right to Read initiative. And what do you hope to achieve with this? It's probably a little self-explanatory considering your passion for reading, but what do you hope to achieve with this?
Okay, so in February of this year, 2022, the Ontario Human Rights Commission released a report called the Right to Read Inquiry, and it was based on a couple years of looking at students' right to read. And this was put on initially looking at dyslexic students who were not getting access to the education that they needed. And it was actually based off a case that they used as an example, saying this isn't acceptable, with a kid that I went to school with at the school specializing in learning disabilities. And this report is amazing. Yes, there's room for improvement, but it's not one that's specific to Ontario, specific to Canada, specific to North America. The recommendations, there are 157 recommendations in this document. And it's only about 5 or 6 pages just looking at the appendix with the recommendations. And it takes you step by step what you have to do to go from where the schools are at now that are still, entrenched in that balanced literacy whole language approach to teaching reading using programs like Reading Recovery and Fontes and Pinnell, to moving towards one that's associated or aligned with structured literacy, the science of reading.
Yeah.
So the Right to Read initiative started as just trying to get that information out there.
Yeah.
And I wanted to have it separate from Garforth education, because in the Right to Read initiative, the only time I mentioned Garforth education is when I introduced myself, if I remember. Hi, my name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education. That's it.
Yeah.
Everything else with the Right to Read initiative is all about the teachers, the administrators, the researchers who are in the fields doing this work, trying to make it better for the students.
Yeah.
And giving them access to the information.
Wow.
So it has kind of snowballed. So I started doing these interviews talking about the various recommendations and what people were doing on March 4th, and today is July 7th. And if you give me a second, I can tell you how many interviews I've done for it. I think it's close to 65. And honestly, in some days I'm doing, like today I've done 3.
Gosh.
Let's see, let's scroll down here. As of today, I have done 72 interviews.
Gosh, sort of
Since
become
March
a thing. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's all about helping teachers understand best practices and also understand that they're not alone. I'm not the only one that found that my teacher education program didn't give me the skills that I needed to teach students how to read. Yeah. It's actually a very common feeling. And the Ontario Human Rights Read Commission actually talks about teacher education programs and better preparations for pre-service teachers. So I've done an open call. Any teacher that wants to talk to me, I'll talk to them. I want to hear your story, hear what you're doing, and make it so that other teachers can understand they're not alone in this change. Yes, it's scary. Yes, there's so much to do, so much to learn, but it's possible. Yeah. Everything is possible, right? Yeah. And giving them those little success stories and realizing, teachers that are just 1 year into this, what are they doing? Teachers that are 2 years into this, teachers that were trained and did reading recovery for years, who have shifted, teachers that have been whole language teachers, trained in whole language. What made them question, why did they look further? Why did they decide to change their practice after 40 years of teaching?
Yeah. And I think there are certain things that are just good practice. I mean, we've talked about these things a little bit in this discussion today. And I think it's really important not to get kind of attached to a process or a program or to adopt a theory without actually knowing the mechanics and the good practice behind why we and how we teach people to read, and not being too committed to something that maybe isn't working as well as it could, and probably doing damage to some of our readers as well. Dr. Kathryn Garforth, I just want to ask you a couple of questions just as we wrap up. And one of them, is Australian teachers are currently on a well-earned break. We'll be returning to our classrooms in a week or so. What advice would you give teachers that are returning to the classroom about how to engage with their students that maybe have additional learning needs or additional challenges? How can we do a better job of that?
Taking the time to get them to know them as a person
Yeah.
and find that thing that they love and their passion and learn something about it.
Yeah.
Because having that teacher that has some shared common interest or willing to talk to you about your favorite thing gets that buy-in.
Yeah.
And makes it so that you want to work that little bit more, and also help create that growth mindset.
Yeah.
Right. Not that fixed mindset. That makes a huge difference. And having students realize that, I mean, that motto that the school had, if you can't learn the way we teach, we'll teach the way you learn, I think should be on the front of every school door. But looking at ways that you can put that to heart. And yes, it does mean extra work on your part, but there are great communities and resources out there that are wanting to help you learn and get there.
That's so important. And I think for me, being a parent as well has really, really transformed and changed the way that I interact with the people, with the students in my class. I think I've always been kind and considerate and all of that kind of stuff with my students, but it's just really reminded me of the importance of personalization, taking the time to get to know my students, to caring for them, because I think of some of the most challenging students that I've had in my class over the years. They're also someone's most precious thing. And it's something that, and so for me, I think just remembering that these are little humans that are trying to work out the world. We need to celebrate their differences. We need to champion them. And like I said, if they're not learning the way that we teach, we need to change the way that we are teaching, because it is our responsibility.
Well, I know reading is my passion, but another thing that I feel that all teachers need to spend the time understanding is executive functioning. Because there are so many times where executive functioning weakness impacts behavior, and we're setting these kids up for failure before we even start instruction. And especially when we're working in those primary years, recognizing that this is when kids just start developing those executive functioning skills. And if there is any form of neurodiversity in the equation, they could easily be between 3 and 5 years delayed in those. So you're working with students that have preschool level executive functioning skills.
Gosh. And it also says so much, I think, about having high expectations for our kids, and not writing them off because they maybe see the world differently. Or I think it's really important, because kids tend to live up to the expectations that you have for them. And I can't imagine how hard it would have been to go through what you went through in school and what countless other students did. But I'm also so grateful that you did, because you get to really change the way that we approach these challenges moving forward. And I think as well, it's such an incredible display of your tenacity and determination and your refusal to listen, and potentially your stubbornness, and that's not a bad thing. And I'm so grateful, like I said, for your work and for the example that you are to so many. And on that, final question, Kathryn, what do you want your legacy to be in this space? What do you perceive as success?
Success is when we have universal screening and we have that 95% rate of students reading by the end of grade 1 and still having it at the end of grade 3. Yes, there are going to be students that need that additional support, and that's okay. But it means having that, we are going to have the resources and the ability to really focus on those students that need it. This isn't just going to help their academic outcomes, it's going to help their life outcomes. So much research has been done in prisons looking at mental health issues and suicides that can have roots back to reading problems.
Gosh.
And that's not fair.
No, it's not fair. Well, I think you are well on your way to seeing that legacy come to fruition. And I am hugely, like I said, hugely grateful for your work and that you would take the time to talk to me today all the way over in Canada. And I'll put all of the show notes and where people can find out more about you in the show notes of the podcast, so people can get in touch. But thank you for your time, and you are a shining example of what is possible when we don't listen to people's opinions of us. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
You're welcome. Take care.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the Art of Teaching podcast today. I hope that you, like me, got some valuable insights out of our discussions. For show notes, please visit theartofteachingpodcast.com. And I've also created a private Facebook group where we can continue the discussion there. The link will be in the show notes. Thanks again for listening, and can't wait to see you for next week's episode.